her initial construction of the food pyramid had fruits and vegetables at the bottom, which I think is great, had olive oil called out in it. Hit me, producer Potts.
Dr. Sarah, we have a question from one of our amazing Patreon members. They said, Dr. Sarah, you have said before only a small percentage of Americans know MyPlate even exists, and an even smaller percentage try to follow those guidelines. It sounds like there's a lot of mistrust with these guidelines. What is the history behind this?
The biggest challenge is that government dietary guidelines have, since their earliest beginnings, preceded the nutritional sciences discoveries that should have been there to inform those guidelines. So the earliest guidelines, I'm going to pull up some notes so I have dates and other information exact and right in front of me. The earliest guidelines came out in 1894. These initial guidelines were very much geared at just reducing the problems of malnutrition and starvation, which were very rampant at the time. But just so that you have a sense, we were pretty sure some vitamins existed, but we hadn't isolated the first vitamin yet for like another 30 some odd years. So the existence of vitamins was like fairly well known. We still hadn't isolated the chemicals. Like we still didn't know the chemical composition of vitamins. There's still a bunch of minerals that are essential that we still hadn't figured out were actually nutritive. So in these like earliest beginnings of the guidelines, it was very much focused on high calorie foods. And actually in the earliest guidelines, there were some pretty disparaging remarks about vegetables, which is fascinating, right? Like, vegetables, it's just roughage. Like really, like not excited about vegetables. Arguably the most important food to eat regularly for long-term health, right? So then USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans took their like earliest form in 1916. They introduced food groups. So the recommendation was consume liberally from 5 groups: milk and meat, cereals, which means grains, vegetables and fruits, fats and fatty foods, and sugars and sugary foods. Those were the initial 5 food groups. Again, like targeting gross malnutrition, right? Getting in more calories being the most important thing we can do, and understanding like what those foods are. And that was the dietary guidelines until 1943. So like during the Second World War, that was when the USDA updated to what they called the Basic 7, which I think is intellectually like the most fascinating out of all of the guidelines, because what they tried to do is they actually tried to divide foods into food groups based on micronutrients. So for example, butter was its whole own food group based on being a great source of vitamin A. It was like butter and fortified margarine, right? Vitamin A fortified margarine, because vitamin A had been chemically identified by this point, and could be added to margarine by this time. They had one food group, green and yellow vegetables. And then separated out of that was oranges, tomatoes, grapefruits, cabbage, and greens. So salad greens were in a separate group based on being a great source of vitamin C. Then they had potatoes and other vegetables and fruits as a group, based on being good sources of fiber, slow burning carbohydrates. Then they had milk and milk products, meat, poultry, fish, and eggs, bread, flour, and cereals. So those were the 7 food groups. And I think, the challenge here was that we just didn't know yet about like half of the vitamins, a bunch of the minerals. We didn't have a sense of macronutrients. I mean, the Krebs cycle had just barely been discovered, not even 20 years earlier by the time this came out. Like we had a very limited view of just like cellular metabolism, how the body uses energy. We had zero understanding of the relative proportions of macronutrients. But like the idea of creating a group for vitamin A and creating a group for vitamin C, fascinating, right? Like really cool. Like that's how I sort of approach food families now. But the sad thing is, in part, there was no internet in 1943, and in part because like you've got like one group that's like green and yellow vegetables, but cabbage and like salad greens is in another group. Like that's confusing, objectively confusing. And so the challenge here was that the communication, right? It was all written pretty much, right? So it was all like pamphlets and flyers at a time where public scientific literacy was even lower than it is now. There's just so much about science that we didn't know yet, right? So it was met with confusion that led to like skepticism, and people just ignored it. They didn't follow it. Kind of a lot like they do now. So while I think like the thought process behind the Basic Seven was fantastic, it was A, flawed because the nutritional sciences discoveries hadn't been made yet, and B, the communication challenges of 7 food groups is challenging. Like that's tough. So the Basic Seven did not get much excitement from the general public. So then the update to that in 1956 was the Basic Four. So simplified those 7 food groups into the milk group, the meat group, the vegetable and fruit group, and the bread and cereal group. I grew up in Canada, so we had Canada Food Guide, and it was very similar, like 4 food groups, and very similar time frame as well. So they had the rules of choosing was 2 to 4 servings from the milk group, 2 or more servings from the meat group, 4 or more servings from the vegetable and fruit group, and 4 or more servings from the bread and cereal group, plus other foods as needed to complete meals and provide additional food, energy, and other food values. And one of the things that went into the decision-making to kind of like get rid of the confusing groups from the Basic Seven and simplify things down to the Basic Four is by this time, right, 1956, there was quite a lot more understood about essential minerals and essential vitamins, and recommended dietary allowances were starting to be established for all of these. And it was basically just thought that lives over here in this one little category, right? Meeting your vitamin and mineral requirements. We've got, daily values for this. We don't need anything else. So let's just help people understand, these really like big picture ways to divide foods. You kind of have your animal protein foods, your dairy products, which are your calcium foods, your fruits and vegetables, which are your phytonutrient, vitamin and mineral foods, and then your grains, which are your slow burning carbohydrate and fiber foods, right? Like just kind of really like simplify it down. And the Basic Four was the Dietary Guidelines Law of the Land until 1992. So they were around for decades. And now during those decades, we had Ansel Keys and all of his work, right? So we had the saturated fat and cholesterol hypotheses of the 50s, 60s, and 70s as being the causes of cardiovascular disease. So we had this like push to low-fat diets. We also had the demonization of red meat and processed meats as the cause of cancer. And so we had like already this, like medical establishment recommendations to reduce red meat, to reduce fat, right? We had so many low-fat products from the 70s and 80s. Low-fat salad dressing was really, popular, right? Like all of that was also happening. And so when the guidelines were like reevaluated in the 80s and early 90s before launching the Food Guide Pyramid in 1992, first of all, the science was quite a little bit different on the roles of especially saturated fat and cholesterol. Like that really kind of solidified more in the 90s that dietary cholesterol is only an issue for people with familial hypercholesteremia, and that saturated fat as long as it's below 10% of calories is fine. And actually, what's interesting is right now there is a scientist sort of like reevaluating whether that limit on saturated fat only applies to added saturated fats, like adding butter or margarine to foods, and whether or not it necessarily applies to whole food sources of saturated fat. That's like an open question still right now in nutritional sciences. So at that time, the science, did point to cholesterol and saturated fat, therefore animal products like eggs and red meat, as not being great. And was pointing to fiber as being really important. But interestingly, in the development of the food guide pyramid, there was a lot of competing interests. So in the creation of the food pyramid, so there's some really interesting, like behind the scenes stories. The USDA director for like developing nutritional guidelines at the time was a woman named Louise Light, and she wrote about this in her book. I don't know if her book, it's called What to Eat. I don't know if it's in print anymore or if it's easy to get a hold of. And apparently, like she's since passed away. And apparently her daughter has been quoted saying there were lots of skeletons still in her closet. Like there were lots of secrets that she didn't share. But she was really upset at how the process of creating the food pyramid happened. So her initial construction of the food pyramid had fruits and vegetables at the bottom, which I think is great, had olive oil called out in it, and had grains like up, with like, especially refined grains were like separate up with like candy and other things to limit. And so it looked very different, like her team going through all the scientific literature, trying to represent the consensus in nutritional sciences in a easy to implement graphical form to update the basic four. It looked a lot different than what we saw actually released in 1991, 1992. And part of that was, she was told it had affordability of food was like a concern, and that's why grains had to be on the bottom because they were the cheapest food. And there was also the influence of the food lobby. The beef lobby didn't want to have red meat up in the top of the food pyramid with candy. They wanted to be lower down. So there were a lot of like competing interests. And I think the fact that like some of those stories have become public, even though we don't know all of the things that went down, I think that is a major reason for the apathy. And I think that the other challenge was like the food guide pyramid. It's like 6 to 11 servings of grains on the bottom. Like that's, it was just way more servings of just food compared to what was in the basic four. And when you're focusing on that much grains as the base, the foundation of your pyramid, you're not actually getting the fruit and vegetable servings that you need. And so the net effect was that Americans on average ate more grains than recommended. So like when MyPlate came out in 2011, I think, the serving recommendations is like 3 servings of grains, whole grains per day for females and 3.5, I think, for males. And yet like the average servings is almost double that for people, right? And that's like a leftover of the food pyramid showing us this, cartoons of all these different grain-based foods, including lots of refined grains in that base, graphical image. So I think the apathy kind of comes from, first it was confusing, then it was oversimplified, then it was flawed, like some things that were just wrong and not representative of the current science, in which we can see the influence of parties that don't have like optimal human nutrition as their goal, right? The goal is to create a guideline for like what is the healthiest way to eat. And then other people came in and said, but you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, you have to do this. And then in the end, it doesn't look like the best way for humans to eat, right? And so I think that the food pyramid and the missteps there are a major reason why people have tuned out. And then at the same time, you have the rise in popularity of fad diets, no more reflective of consensus in nutritional sciences than the food pyramid was, and maybe in many cases less so. But with the internet and before and after photos and charismatic people being able to say, look at how great my life is, and this is what I did. Don't you want to do this too? Don't you want to buy it from me, right? At the same time, the voices talking about nutrition became very widespread, and it ended up diluting the messaging from USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So in like the 2015 to 2020 and then the 2020 to 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, they've made a big shift back to more fruits and vegetables, eating the rainbow, the full color of fruits and vegetables, more seafood, more legumes, consuming, saturated fats and sugars in moderation. They've made a lot of changes that are reflecting how nutritional sciences have changed, and their graphical representation has changed to MyPlate, which is now 5 groups, right? It's more than the basic 4, but is more reflective of the groups that were in the food pyramid. So you've got a quarter of your plate for whole grains, for protein foods, which includes plant proteins like legumes and nuts and seeds, which are not very high protein to be counted as a protein food, but that's how the USDA dietary guidelines do it. And then a smaller quarter for fruit, a larger quarter for vegetables, and then a glass of milk on the side is how MyPlate is done now. And I think I think it's still not fully representative of where nutritional sciences are. I think the way to break it up is a little bit different, which is why I've created a ripoff version of it called the Nutrivore Meal Map, which I think makes those important corrections to better reflect scientific consensus. But I do think that overall, MyPlate is the closest nutritional guidelines have ever been in terms of a graphical representation of reflecting nutritional sciences. And there's so much more we know now, especially compared to 50s and 60s, when, basic 4 was sort of reigned supreme. So what's interesting, though, is I think because of the rise in popularity of fad diets, because of just what a misstep the food pyramid was, only about a quarter of Americans have even heard of MyPlate, like even know that that's a thing that exists. And the most recent analysis that I've seen is that 8.3% of Americans are trying to eat according to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's because historically they've been confusing, or they haven't been easy to follow, right? They haven't actually reflected nutritional sciences or supported healthy eating patterns. And they just kind of they got there too late, right? So they got to, we're finally in the range, too late. And so part of it is, losing control over the messaging thanks to the internet and so many popular diet gurus and their books, right? Part of it is just the distrust, especially after the food pyramid. People don't trust the guidelines now to be free of influence from parties that don't have a healthy diet as their end goal, right? Because that was definitely a contributor to how the food guide pyramid turned out. So I think it's really fascinating science to keep in mind. Nowadays, if you do a nutritional analysis of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, they still fall short on some micronutrients. Hang on, because I have that in my book. The 20 to 25 Dietary Guidelines for Americans deliver insufficient amounts of iron, vitamin D, vitamin E, choline, and vitamin B9, which is folate. So there's still 5 essential nutrients. We can maybe give them a pass on vitamin D because it's actually more important to get vitamin D from the sun. for essential nutrients, that which even the way they've crafted the more detailed version that you get in like the giant booklet of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, that's still falling short of meeting nutritional needs in very important ways, right? So I think that all that together is like why there's so much apathy. Communication challenges, guidelines being confusing and not reflecting nutritional science, guidelines being too influenced by parties that don't have the public health's best interest at heart, and then at the rise of conflicting messages from diet gurus. It kind of all feeds into now I think the dietary guidelines are pretty solid. Again, I would change some things to MyPlate, but if you look at all of the important, the foods that are nutritionally important that I talk about in my book, those are all discussed as nutritionally important in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans in like the giant booklet. But it's just not fully reflected, I think, in MyPlate. So I would change MyPlate, but I think overall the guidelines are pretty solid now. Few tweaks we could do to get those extra essential nutrients, right? But now someone like me on the internet has a way bigger voice in terms of teaching people about nutrition than the USDA has. And that is just the reality of 120 years of, whoops, didn't do that right. So it's a shame, because in an ideal world, their guidelines would have always reflected the most current science, have been communicated correctly, and then it could have really made a difference in public health. And now, even though the guidelines are pretty good, if only 8% of people are even trying to follow them, then that's not going to make much of a dent.
Wow, that was so fascinating. I really appreciate you walking us through the history of all of that. And it's just really insightful to see the progression and how everything changed and how we did get to where we are today. And then it just also comes back around to what you're doing with Nutrivore and the things you're trying to change and the impact you're trying to make in public health at large. And it just is very inspiring. So thank you so much. And if you don't already have Sarah's book that she's got there, Nutrivore, please go get it. It is really fascinating and interesting. And it has a lot of interesting history about the history of diets in it, like we talked about a little in this video. And it's really actually, it's like a mix of storytelling in the beginning of the book, along with then all the practical stuff. So I listened to it as an audiobook, which Sarah did narrate. So if you like audiobooks, you can get that. But it's just, it was an easy listen. It wasn't like other diet or nutrition books. So I know I'm biased, but if you haven't, do yourself a favor, go get the book.
The number one feedback from reviews of the book have been like, thematically, this helped me finally eat a healthy diet and stop dieting, right? Like, it's thematically like, this has helped me be more consistent with healthy food choices than anything ever before, because I'm no longer restricting foods. I'm no longer viewing foods as bad, right? I really am eating any food, getting every nutrient, and improving my health. The next like group of like feedback of reviews is like, this did, I followed the Nutrivore weekly serving matrix and I lost this much weight. My cholesterol dropped this much, right? Like, here's like tangible health improvements, right? Like, this has been so great for me. Look at how this has improved my health. And then like the third, like the minority, but is, wow, I have never actually read a nutrition book all the way through. Like, wow, this is so fascinating. The historical anecdotes are, really interesting. This book is just like an actual lovely read. It was my goal in writing it to write a page turner, right? To write a book that is fun to read, that you like feel like you can't put down. And that's a really hard thing to do in nutrition, especially non-fad diets, but more like balanced, nutrient focused, like teaching you about what different nutrients do in the body. That's a really tall ask, but the feedback has been that I accomplished it. So yeah, I hope you think the same.
Thanks, Dr. Sarah.
Thank you.